a less finely judged ambivalence was in evidence in the emperor's attitude to the Jews. On the one hand, Jewish communities were officially liberated from the prison-like ghettos to which the ancient regime had consigned them. After 1806, for example, Frankfurt's infamous Judengasse ghetto no longer resembled a gigantic Marshalsea, though Jews still paid special taxes and were banned from entering coffee houses or walking through the city squares. On the other, Napoleon was personally anti-Semitic, as he showed at the Grand Sanhedrin of Jewish leaders he convoked in April 1807. A number of discriminatory measures were ordained. Jews could practice their religion only under state supervision, they were denied recognition as a separate nation, 1/3 of their marriages had to be with non-Jews, and so on. These laws were supposedly to hold good throughout the extended empire, though the fate of Jewish communities largely depended on the attitude of the local rulers or proconsuls. In Holland and Italy Jews fared badly, but in Westphalia Jerome, a notable Philosemite, admitted them to full citizenship, while in neighboring Berg most of the restrictions against them were lifted. Nevertheless, in general the lot of Jews was harsh. They were robbed, swindled and unable to recoup debts owed them, while in Holland Louis became notorious for forming a Jewish regiment from boys taken from the poor or press-ganged from orphanages. With a few exceptions, the rulers of Napoleon's empire were a mediocre bunch. Perhaps the most spectacularly incompetent were the Murats in Naples. Joseph, when king of Naples, had made a good start. Aided by his excellent ministers Mit, Roederer and Salisti, he deployed a force of 40,000 men to combat brigandage, set up a ministry of the interior, and a provincial intendant system modeled on the French prefects, established a property tax, supervised the sale of church property, and reorganized the fiscal system. The Murats, even with what many claim were even more talented ministers, Zerko at the interior and Rixardi at justice, undid much of the good work and required constant injections of French blood and treasure to maintain their position. Murat, fancying himself as an independent monarch fully the equal of Napoleon, was mortified when he discovered that the army obeyed the emperor, not him. Detesting his scheming wife Caroline ever more daily, Murat worked himself into such a state of nervous tension that, when not womanizing, he sat up all night reading police reports. He alienated the emperor by blatantly infringing the continental blockade, allowing U.S. ships to smuggle British goods into Naples. His invasion of Sicily, finally attempted with Napoleon's connivance in the autumn of 1810, predictably ended in miserable failure. Murat's lackluster performance was thrown into relief by the generally good showing of the Viceroy of French Italy, Eugene de Beauharnais, who presided in Milan over an area divided into 24 departments. In northern Italy, Napoleon's innovations, which he claimed on St. Helena, were the groundwork for his aim of Italian unification, built on what had been done by the Austrians. There was little opposition to Bonaparte in northern Italy, and the great landowners accepted posts in the new administration, happy to further the emperor's plan to use Italy as France's agricultural base, supplying sheep, rice, corn, cotton and sugar and providing a market for French manufactured goods. The real opposition to Napoleon was in Rome, where he succeeded in alienating all vital social sectors. Quite apart from the kidnapping of the Pope, he upset the clergy by introducing divorce, he outraged the nobility by the treatment of Pius and the plans to remove the Vatican itself to Paris. By extensive conscription levies he failed to gain the love of the common people, and he alienated the bourgeoisie, mainly lawyers, by abolishing the pontifical tribunals. In any case, this nascent middle class depended too heavily on the church and the old nobility to be able to break with them. Napoleon's popularity, evident in northern Italy if not Rome, seemed to have been an Alpine affair, for in Switzerland too he won golden opinions as the man who had swept away the unpopular Helvetian Republic and protected the Confederation Helvetique. His R-803 Act of Mediation was widely perceived to have maintained a rough and ready form of social equality between Swiss citizens and to have preserved the autonomy of the cantons. Additionally, a treaty of alliance gave the Confederation a proper status within the empire. But, here as elsewhere, it was the continental system that lost the emperor many erstwhile friends. The ranks of the anti-Bonapartists, originally confined to aristocrats who had taken the Austrian side, were swollen after R-807 by tradesmen and industrialists who suffered the consequences of the blockade. The Swiss were further alienated when the French annexed the Valais and Raite-Row and when they occupied the Tessin. Then there was the issue of the Alps themselves. Napoleon favored the Mont-Cenis route to Italy more than the Simplon as the axis of the route Paris-Turin-Genoa, so that by R-807-08 the traffic through the Mont-Cenis was 4 times that through the Simplon. In Raite-Row, the annexation of the Valais made the Simplon even more important by simplifying the work of customs officers. It was only after the annexation of Illyria that the Swiss retrieved their share of Alpine traffic. it became obvious that the traffic in Levantine cotton would soon bring the Mont-Cenis route to a standstill, so, by a decree on RZ April rate RR, the emperor divided the traffic between the two routes, and gave the same rights to the Simplon as to the Mont-Cenis. Another success story in Napoleon's empire was the fate of the 9 Belgian departments, formerly in the Austrian Empire, which formed the nucleus of modern Belgium, capital generated by the sale of national property, and stimulated by Napoleon's huge internal market brought the beginnings of Belgian industrialization, especially in shipbuilding, coal mining and cotton manufacturing. It was the sale of national property and its consequences that kept the bourgeoisie loyal to Napoleon. Curiously, the Belgian peasantry were also pro-Bonaparte, and this is something of an historical puzzle, since, ferociously pro-clerical, the peasants stayed loyal to the church, did not buy its confiscated lands, and were thus not co-opted into the Bonapartist economic nexus. Matters were otherwise in Holland, ruled by his brother Louis, which was as anti-Napoleon as Belgium was pro. 3 things in particular led to the debacle of King Louis's abdication in Rate Row. In the first place, Louis tried to adapt the Code Napoleon to local laws and customs, and for his pains was severely reprimanded by Napoleon, who wrote sternly, "A nation of 800,000 inhabitants cannot have a separate legislation." Rome gave her laws to her allies. Why should the laws of France not be adopted in Holland? Even more seriously, Louis connived at contraband so as not to ruin Dutch trade, and thus made Holland the weak link in the continental system. But what particularly infuriated Napoleon was Louis's seeming inability to deal with the ultimately unsuccessful invasion of Walcheren by British forces in July, R809. In March Rate Row he ordered Louis to hand over to direct imperial rule all his lands south of the Rhine. Louis, unable to stomach such humiliation, beat Napoleon to the punch by resigning on July. Napoleon's dealings with Louis showed that, beneath the rhetoric about European integration, he ultimately believed in brute force to achieve his will. His correspondence, even when delivering justified rebukes, breathed a spirit of contempt. The emperor was impatient with the fine points of Louis's arguments for moderation, and insisted that a true ruler knew how to force his subjects to come to heel. On one occasion when Louis appealed to the ideals of honor, justice and decency, Napoleon snapped back, "You might have spared me this fine display of your principles." He always believed in tough measures to cow a recalcitrant population, arguing that the alleged brutality saved lives in the long run, and even suggested that a little bloodletting was good for the body politic. One of his most revealing letters was to Joseph in early R808, when his brother was still king of Naples. "I wish Naples would attempt a rising. As long as you have not made an example, you will not be their master. Every conquered country must have its rising." Napoleon's authoritarian stance was in part a reflection of his natural way of looking at the world, but was also designed to make sure his family did nothing without consulting him. The imperial correspondence contains dozens of missives sent out to his siblings which are often glorified nagging. During Joseph's 2 years as king of Naples, his brother deluged him with advice on how to run the kingdom. The following, from R806, is typical: "Make changes if you must, but bring the code into force nevertheless. It will consolidate your power and, once in force, all entails will vanish, with the result that there will be no powerful families except for those whom you choose to create as your vassals. That is why I myself have always gone to such lengths to see that it is carried out." As king of Westphalia, Napoleon gave detailed instructions: "Do not listen to those who will tell you that your people, used as they are to subjection, will receive your benefits gratefully. There is more enlightenment in the kingdom of Westphalia than you will be told, and only in the confidence and love of the population will your throne stand firmly. What is above all desired in Germany is that you will grant to those who do not belong to the nobility, but possess talents, an equal claim to offices, and that all vestiges of serfdom and of barriers between the sovereign and the lowest class of people shall be completely done away with. The benefits of the Code Napoleon, legal procedure in open courts, the jury, these are points by which your monarchy should be distinguished. Your people must enjoy a liberty, an equality, a prosperity unknown in the rest of Germany." But by R809 the emperor's patience with Trôme was wearing thin, and the iron fist was increasingly evident. "I think it is ridiculous of you to tell me that the people of Westphalia do not agree. If the people refuse what makes for their own welfare, they are guilty of anarchism, and the first duty for the prince is to punish them." Of the myriad issues thrown up by Napoleon's empire, we may select 4 as salient. Was the empire run on homogeneous principles, as the emperor boasted? Did it subscribe to revolutionary or egalitarian ideals? Who supported it and who opposed it? Was it a pilot version of European integration or merely a gigantic spoils system? The most seductive of all Napoleonic myths is the one he himself promoted, that his aim was the noble ideal of pan-European federation, with all nations linked in peace, a project he claimed was vitiated by twin evils: the hatred of reactionary monarchies and the envy of Britain, the pirates swayed only by low materialistic motives. In fact, Napoleon's Europe had nothing in common with true federalism. It was a collection of satellite states whose interests, were always to be subordinate to those of France. This was the core contradiction that explained all the rough edges in the empire, and all the passages of arms with his siblings. As rulers, they tried to stand up for the interests of their subjects but were crushed by Napoleon, who had given them their thrones on the quite different understanding that they would always put France first. The heterogeneity of Napoleon's empire was thus a product of many things: the success of the kings in frustrating the emperor, the need not to offend the interests and susceptibilities of Bonaparte supporters within the satellite nations, the obeisance paid to powerful local customs and folkways, and the military imperatives of the emperor himself. The degree of harmonization and integration was greatest in the Pays Réunis and least in the Pays Allies, with the Pays Conquis presenting a mixed and patchy picture. On paper, the empire was supposed to be unified by the Code Napoleon and Enlightenment reforms, and it is true that some of Napoleon's prefects did carry out reforms, introducing new agricultural techniques, new crops, improved livestock, marsh reclamation schemes, and the building of flood barriers. In Rome, for example, the Comte de Tournon reformed prisons and hospitals, fostered a cotton industry, and reclaimed part of the Pontine marshes. Yet the administrative impact of France on the empire was superficial. On the one hand, the satellite states mirrored the French model, with departments and prefects. The notables system was also replicated, with landed property, not hereditary status, as the basis of political power. But by and large the local bourgeoisie resisted the full implementation of the code. French officials in turn largely bent with the local wind and connived at infractions. In Westphalia, Jerome allowed entails to conciliate the nobility, but, even when Napoleon forced him out, he did not replace his officials. In Naples there was only partial introduction of the code because of the clash of French interests and those of the local bourgeoisie. The so-called uniform taxation system was regressive by necessity, as the local bourgeoisie would not tolerate anything else. When Louis tried to introduce a more progressive form of raising revenue, he quickly had to shelve his plans because of opposition from the propertied classes. The solution usually offered to integration was to pay lip service to the Code Napoleon and other shibboleths of unity while working out local solutions. Sometimes this resulted in a syncretism of old and new, as in Aragon, where the sub-prefects retained the old title of corregidors. More often the resolution was the one familiar from 20th century Latin America, an elaborate formal constitution which was systematically disregarded. The emperor made sure that the various elected assemblies created by the many different constitutions were just so many talking shops. Napoleon's attitude to uniformity and integration was an odd mixture of dogmatism and flexibility. He was always impatient of cultural differences, and as the years went on his determination to impose the code and other monolithic reforms hardened. Illyria, for instance, was a deeply religious country still essentially in the Middle Ages, yet the emperor tried to govern it without the help of the clergy and even in the teeth of their opposition. By 1810 scarcely recognizable was the man who had boasted to Roederer 10 years before of his flexibility. It is by turning Catholic that I finished the war in the Vendée, by turning Muslim that I established myself in Egypt, by turning ultramontane that I won the Italian mind. Yet Napoleon was always prepared to be flexible when his military interests were at stake. The obvious example was in Poland where, needing the support of the traditional elite, he did not even attempt to abolish feudal privileges. In Spain, whenever reform clashed with military exigencies, it was the latter that won. One can even argue that the reforms themselves were anyway dictated by military considerations. Napoleon's aim was to mobilize resources for his campaigns more rapidly than his ancient regime opponents, who were constrained by restrictions which gave tax immunities and exemptions to the church, the nobility, to city corporations and many other bodies. Reform in the Napoleonic Empire came about if it suited Napoleon's military purposes, or if the bourgeoisie gave it their consent. Where no economic interests were involved, they often did. The logic of integration led Napoleon towards annexation in the Pays Réunis and Pays Conquis. Lacking a system of direct rule through the prefects in the conquered territories, Napoleon tried to keep control by putting his siblings in as kings or rulers. The family courts were further shackled by the presence of loyal French officials: Roederer in Naples, Bugnat in Berg, Simon in Westphalia. The emperor particularly liked to impose his favored generals as war ministers, as in the case of Dumas in Naples and Deb in Westphalia. Another ploy was to use his marshals as de facto viceroys, Devout in Poland, Suchet in Aragon, Marmont in Illyria. The problem of the Pays allies was more tricky, for there was little he could do except exert pressure through his ambassadors. Notable in this area were Heduville in Frankfurt, Burgoying in Dresden and Bignon in Warsaw. Saxony displayed particular independence, with Frederick Augustus taking a pick-and-mix approach to the Napoleonic system. He favored centralization to increase the power of the state, but was impatient with the bogus assemblies and the representative principle in general. Saxony also retained the institutions of the ancient regime, though elsewhere in Germany elements of the prefect department system were introduced. The real snag with Germany was that reform could not make much headway in the teeth of opposition from local elites whose support Napoleon needed. The impression is sometimes given in Anglo-centric histories that Napoleon held down his empire by main force and that he had no collaborators in the subject or satellite states. Nothing could be farther from the truth. A wide spectrum of pro-Bonapartists is evident in the extended empire. In the first place, there were the old elites themselves, who looked to Napoleon to sustain their power. Had they attempted anything so quixotic as a people's war against France, they would very soon have seen their own privileges swept away in the whirlwind. This explains why, even in Spain, there was support for the Bonapartes and why the grandees backed Joseph. Many hidalgos and afrancesado bourgeois saw the rising as an assault on the Enlightenment as much as on Napoleon. There was even a kind of ideological harmony between Napoleon and the old elites, for the empire represented a return to monarchical absolutism and its centralism, even in its attack on the church. Politicians and bureaucrats associated with absolutism worked happily on administration in the satellites. Napoleon particularly welcomed such collaboration as it furthered his Alexander the Great project of fusion between old and new elites. But it was not just in Spain that the intellectual middle class supported Bonaparte. In Bavaria there were influential bureaucrats and bourgeois, notably Maximilian von Montgelas, who took the view that the rising tide of German nationalism was simply an aristocratic ploy to restore their privileges. Moreover, it would be simple-minded to think that nationalism always worked against Napoleon. In Poland, nationalists yearning for an independent state backed him, as did those who wanted a united Italy. There were close bonds linking Napoleon and those agitating for Hungarian independence from Austria, while in Greece and Romania he was something of a hero figure for the support he gave those striving for independence from the Turks. One Italian officer summed up well this process of liberation through collaboration. What does it matter whether one is serving the ambitions of this or that man? The great aim must be to learn to make war, which is the only skill that can free us. Napoleon was also seen as a very useful partner by a rising capitalist class. For bourgeois entrepreneurs, the empire was a gold mine, which combined the maximum of opportunity with the minimum of risk. It apart from the myriad entrepreneurial opportunities created by an era of rapid change and the sale of national property, there were vast fortunes to be made from the Napoleonic Wars themselves, in everything from armaments to military victualling. The centralized administration and the efficient police force combined to provide the certainty and predictability economic investors traditionally like. Freemasonry, the ideology of the rising capitalist class, was spread rapidly over Europe by the many Jacobins and freethinkers in Napoleon's armies. However, the misleading traditional picture of an empire that satisfied nobody contains some truth. Of their very nature, acts of resistance and dissatisfaction tended to make more of an impact than active or passive acquiescence. But the level of armed resistance was low. Apart from Spain, there were only two revolts that seriously challenged French authority, in Calabria and the Tyrol. In both these areas, significantly, there was a long-standing tradition of military mobilization and National Guard service. The trouble in Calabria, which eventually obliged Murat to use draconian measures, was a mixture of xenophobia by bands of brigands and pot-stirring by the British operating from Sicily. Napoleon's old nemesis Sir Sidney Smith was active in this process. The revolt in the Tyrol looked like a peasant jackery, but turned out to be more than just an insurrection on economic issues. It was a confused Woodbine-dependence movement, harking back to an alleged golden age in the Tyrol, Catholic, xenophobic and anti-Semitic. In a word, the classic counter-revolutionary movement. Sidney Smith's role as agitator was here played by Archduke John, who had not the slightest intention of accepting an independent Tyrol. Elsewhere, discontent took the form of banditry, desertion, absenteeism or, at a lower level, grumbling, alienation and the occasional demonstration or riot. There were very many reasons why Napoleon's formal and informal subjects should have been discontented with his empire. Perhaps the overriding grievance was his insatiable demand for manpower, which in turn led to tough conscription policies. At the beginning of his reign, Napoleon boasted that demography was on his side, because in 1789 3/4 of France's 28 million inhabitants were under 40, and therefore there was no limit to the numbers of men he could raise. In France only 7% of the male population was drafted, but even this figure featured in popular perception as a universal call-up. Elsewhere in the empire the percentage was higher. All the allies were obliged to provide a contingent for the Grand Army in proportion to population, but Napoleon continually increased his demand for troops between I-808 and I-812. The respective figures for Westphalia are instructive: I-6 infantry battalions, I-2 cavalry squadrons and 3 artillery batteries in I-808 but 29, 28 and 6 respectively in I-812. Similar figures from other parts of the empire show the same trend. In I-808 the Grand Duchy of Warsaw provided infantry, cavalry and artillery in the amount of 36 battalions, 26 squadrons and I-2 batteries, but by I-812 this had risen to 60, 70 and 20 respectively. For Württemberg the corresponding figures were I-2 and 3 in I-808 and 20, 23 and 6 in I-812. In addition to regulars, the empire had to raise and supply militia and national guards. At the peak of Napoleon's campaigns, in I-812, Italy supplied I-0 regulars, Bavaria II-0, Warsaw 89,000, Saxony 66,000, Westphalia 52,000 and Berg I-3, 200. The minimum total of foreign conscripts serving in the Grand Army was 720,000, but some experts believe the true figure may have been almost 1 million men. Resentment at this huge level of conscription was both individual and collective. Individually, those who served realized that their chances of survival were not that great. Of the 52,000 Westphalians, only I-8,000 survived, and only I-7-0 out of a 29,000-strong contingent from Baden. Conscription also left the wives and families of these men in destitution. A vicious circle was set up whereby young men, criminalized by the poverty resulting from the drafting of their fathers, were themselves dragooned into the ranks as punishment. Collectively, each locality in the empire had to bear the massive costs of keeping these armies in being. Napoleon promised France he would make his wars pay for themselves, but he made no such promise to the satellites, and anyway his tactic of self-financing campaigns did not always work, notably in Spain and Russia. Even conquered Portugal paid only 7 millions of the 100 million francs levied as reparations after the I-807 campaign. To maintain his armies, Napoleon was forced into deficit spending. Military expenditure accounted for 40% of the total French budget in I-806 and 58% by I-8I3. In an economy where Napoleon opposed state borrowing on principle and imposed a rigid metallic currency, his campaigns were bound to have a serious deflationary effect, and this was indeed the deep cause of the economic crises of I-805-07 and I-8II-4. To palliate likely internal discontent in I-805 he set up an extraordinary fund, administered by La Bouillerie under the authority of Daru, the Intendant General of the occupied countries. Between 182-09 this fund allegedly received 734 million francs. In 1810, as his wars created greater and greater demands for money, Napoleon put the fund on an official basis. A senatus consultum of the 30th of January set up an extraordinary domain, which was to be used only by the emperor and only by decree for subsidizing the expenses of the Grand Army. To soften the blow, it was announced that the extraordinary domain would also be used to reward great military or civil services, for public works and to encourage the arts. The financial situation was far worse in the satellite states, where expenditure on the army reached the dizzy levels of 80% of the total budget. In Westphalia the economics of the madhouse finally took over. Napoleon imposed a contribution to the army of 31 million francs, plus U.S. millions for upkeep, when the total state budget was only 34 millions. The irony of this was that the rationalization of finance and the consequent increases in income were simply wasted on the army. Heavy demands for taxes from Napoleon went hand in hand with more efficient land registers, collection methods and fiscal mechanisms. In Berg tax revenues tripled between 1808-13, while in Naples they rose so % in the 3 years after Murat's accession. All this was while the continental system was anyway biting deep into the local economies. In Holland tax revenues yielded about 30 million florins in 182, but so millions in 1809, and in addition there was a quite separate forced loan levied in 1807. When Napoleon annexed Holland in 1810, he liquidated 2/3 of the national debt, leaving penniless the bourgeoisie who had been forced to buy government bonds, the predictable result of having to pay for the total costs of an army conscripted unwillingly in the first place, and for the costs of any French troops billeted outside France was national bankruptcy in many of the satellite states. The debt of the Kingdom of Italy rose from 1 to 5 million lire in 182-11. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw's national debt trebled in the years 1807-11, while luckless Westphalia, which enjoyed the additional privilege of having to pay the costs of 3/0 French troops quartered there in November 1811, saw the national debt rise from 60 million francs to over 200 million, for in addition to Napoleon's exactions, there was the lunatic prodigality of his brother, King Jerome. Napoleon did not mete out such severe financial punishments only to his favored allies. Those who made war on him paid through the nose with war indemnities. Austria was mulcted of 3 million francs for the two ill-judged campaigns of 182nd and 1809. Prussia had to disgorge 6 millions for the catastrophic mistake of Jena, and Hanover, Prussia's appanage, had to pay 50 millions. The extraction of funds from Spain after R808 was big business, with Western Castile contributing 8 million francs in just 6 months in Rate Row. Additionally, the conquered territories were stripped of other significant material resources. In 1806 the Prussians lost 40,000 horses while the Saxons had to abandon all cannon, munitions, and military stores. The twin evils of conscription and taxes to pay for the draftees did not end there. French soldiers in foreign territories lived off the land, a euphemism for large-scale looting. The costs of having French troops quartered on them were so great that many citizens preferred to abandon their homes instead. The brutal French soldiers, many of them rapists and murderers who had chosen the army instead of a prison sentence, took their pick of the local women. Feelings ran high over sex, which was a threefold source of anger and resentment. There was rape pure and simple, there was a high level of prostitution, and there was the phenomenon of peasant girls and others choosing to go off with officers and becoming camp followers. As one French soldier wrote of his experience among the Germans, "They cannot forgive us for having for 20 years caressed their wives and daughters before their very faces." Conscription, taxes, forced levies, debts run up by the Bonaparte family as kings, looting by ordinary soldiers, economic disruption and dislocation, the Catholic backlash triggered by anti-clerical and Freemason soldiery, the affront to local cultures, traditions and folkways which engendered primitive nationalism. Not even this long list of sources of discontent exhausts the alienating impact of Napoleon's empire. Over and above all this was the crucial consideration that Napoleon ran his so-called integrated Europe as a gigantic spoils system. The exiguous revenue base and the hard-pressed satellites was shrunk still further by the estates set aside for the emperor's donateurs. The titles and benefices Napoleon assigned to his marshals were always located in the satellite or annexed states, never in France itself, partly for prudential reasons so as not to alienate French taxpayers, partly to give his generals a strong motive for fighting campaigns beyond the natural frontiers, partly because all worthwhile national property had already been alienated. Never was there a more blatant example of the emperor's boast that I have only conquered kingdoms, to serve the interest of France and help me in all I am doing for her. His barefaced exploitation of the satellite states emerges clearly from one salient fact. First charge on all state revenues went to the entailed incomes of his marshals and other donateurs. Also very clear is Napoleon's determination to run a personal empire, for he rigidly controlled the system of entails and benefices himself. He kept 2 large account books on the corner of his desk, in which names and amounts were listed. In his memoirs, Baron Agathon Fane, successor to Burian and Mendeville as the emperor's secretary, relates how he got his share in the system of imperial rip-off. Napoleon ran his eye over the pages of the ledger, quickly reminding himself who had what. Then he stopped and looked hard at an entry. "Aha, I've found you one. Here you are. R0000 francs income in Pomerania. Let it not be said I've forgotten my secretaries." By rate R4 Napoleon had made grants to 4,994 persons at a cost of nearly 30 million francs a year. In money terms half of this went to 824 generals. There was an inner circle of favored recipients even among the lucky pensioners, for people like Paulin, Devout, Ney, Berthier and 486 other favorites received 24 million francs or 80% of the total amount. Berthier, for example, was made Prince of Neuchâtel, never once visited the place, yet received half the gross revenue of the principality in the 7 years R806, R3. After the decisive battle with the Austrians in I-809 he was made Prince of Wagram, and added a further 250,000 francs to his endowment, making his total annual income 1.3 million francs. Even these lavish sums did not satisfy the marshal's cupidity. The worst offenders were Augereau, Soult, Messina and Victor. Augereau once strode into an Italian pawnshop and stuffed his pockets with jewels. When this was reported to Napoleon, he dismissed the objections cynically. "Don't talk to me about generals who love money. It was only that which enabled me to win the Battle of Eylau." Ney wanted to reach Elbing to procure more funds. The result of Napoleon's refusal to discipline his marshals was predictable. Art treasures were looted across an area stretching from Egypt to Spain and, although some of the paintings found their way into the Louvre, most were purloined for private collections. Soult acquired paintings worth 1.5 million francs, which he pocketed. Napoleon kept back a wealth of choice items for Josephine. Many hundreds more precious artifacts were sold at state auctions. The plunderers habitually lied to the emperor. In December R806 General Lagrange, the French military governor of Hesse and Darmstadt, found the treasure of the Landgrave of Hesse, who had made the mistake of backing the Prussians. The total value of the haul, accumulated painstakingly over the years by the notably miserly I. and Grave, was 19 million francs. In return for a bribe of 1 million francs, Grange fabricated a report that only 8 millions had been unearthed. The remaining 10 millions, in bonds, bills, cash vouchers and mortgage documents were then smuggled out of the country for the exiled Landgrave's use. Napoleon put his foot down only when the personal corruption of his acolytes put in jeopardy the continental system. Bourrienne, as French representative in Hamburg, sold over soon authorizations for the export of illegally imported goods between August 807 and December 8 at rates of 0.25% and 0.5% the value of the merchandise. He made more than 1 million francs from this scam, which meant that goods worth between 60 and millions were exported annually. It was hardly surprising that colonial cotton, sugar and coffee continued to circulate in Germany, Switzerland and Austria at prices lower than in Paris, even after the decrees of I-8-IO, recalled and fined for his corrupt practices, and heedless of the fact that Napoleon had already pardoned him once for embezzlement. The wretched Bourrienne complained of the emperor's ingratitude and became a secret agent for the Bourbons. Many commentators have remarked on Napoleon's hubris in embarking on the adventure in Spain at the very moment his empire looked rock solid. Less attention has been lavished on the objective side of the picture, which shows Napoleon launching into new and quixotic adventures at the very moment the economic, demographic and psychological factors hitherto favoring him were undergoing a reverse. The ethos of the Grand Army shifted from revolutionary virtue to personal gain and advancement, producing a catastrophic decline in morale and esprit de corps. After I-807, the once magnificent army was badly equipped, badly officered and frequently indisciplined. It became increasingly obvious that most of the marshals were of poor military caliber. Napoleon frequently rued the loss of the brilliant Desaix. The reservoir of men was beginning to run dry, and after I-807 the proportion of battle losses was no longer so favorable to the French. The inexperience and poor morale of conscripts after I-807 at its simplest level, a result of having to fight in wars far from France which did not seem to involve national interests, meant the army was not nearly so potent a weapon as in I-796 I-82. Consequently man-oeuvres under fire became less plausible, and therefore battle casualties greater. Above all, the factor of money began to haunt the emperor. An examination of Napoleon's accounts for the period October I-806 to his October I-808 shows a healthy state of affairs. Extraordinary taxes raised 3 IR, 66 Z, 0 francs, property taxes 79,667,000 francs and the foreclosure of coffers R6, QZ, 0. In addition, there was the huge war indemnity of 600 million francs from Prussia, including the remounting of 40,000 cavalry and other supplies. During the same period the expenditure of the Grand Army was 212,879,335 francs. The protracted campaigns in Prussia and Poland had therefore cost the French taxpayer nothing, but this situation was about to change with a vengeance. At the beginning of R-809 Napoleon's empire still looked secure, but in retrospect we can see him already at the edge of a precipice. Perhaps unconsciously Napoleon even realized this, for, as if by pre-established harmony, his health began to decline before his fortunes dipped, and this process can be dated to R-808. His features coarsened, his body grew heavier, his stomach protruded, his look grew less alert and his voice less commanding. The gastric attack at Bayonne in R-808 and the eczema at Vienna in May R-809 were pointers to a valetudinarian future. It was almost as though the Colossus began to crack in anticipation of the unraveling of his life's work.